Up to this point, we have talked about basic variables in PHP. Basic variables, of course, are things that we declare by starting them off with a $sign followed by the actual name of the variable. X equals 9, for example, which we then have the ability to work with. We could echo it and do many other things. I'll say X is $X and a break using string interpolation. If I go over and take a look at that in my browser, I of course end up with X equals 9. And you might remember that one of the features, one of the aspects or attributes of our basic variables is that they are scalar. So if I were to declare a variable like X and assign it a value of 9, but were to then change the value of X, what we end up with is the changed value. Essentially, because X is a traditional scalar variable, it can only hold one value at a time, which means as soon as I assign a new value to that variable, the old value is replaced. Now, in PHP, if we run into a situation where we need something a little bit more complicated, maybe isn't the right word, something a little bit more robust than a basic variable, one of the options that we'll have available to us, something that's very, very handy, are arrays. Now, arrays are probably, again, something that you should have some experience with from previous courses, previous work that you've done, but PHP basically has arrays kind of like you would typically expect. Let's say, for example, that I wanted to create a variable called names, and into that variable, let's say that I wanted to create a PHP array. There are several different ways that we can create this new PHP array. PHP, some of the newer versions of it do have an array literal syntax where we can simply put in a set of square braces. That, however, requires a fairly new version of PHP. So another way we can create an array is by calling PHP's array function. This is the way that I will typically use in most of my videos and most of my examples, because this array function is something that works just fine in modern versions of PHP and also works in almost any version of PHP you might want to go back to. So if you find yourself using an older version of PHP, if that happens to be what's supported at your web host, for example, getting used to using the array function, I think, has a benefit because it's something that will be universally accepted, universally recognized. But here, creating the names variable and assigning to it the result of calling the array function will create a new array for me. Just like in other languages that you've probably played with, PHP arrays essentially give us a way to be able to store multiple values all inside one variable. So here, for example, I could say into the names array, into element 0, assign the name Victrola. Just like you've probably again seen in other languages, with arrays we use a set of square braces, often referred to as subscript notation, to specify an element number, essentially a position, where in that particular array we want to have a value stored. So here I'm asking PHP to store the value, the string Victrola, inside the 0th element of the names array. So position 0 in the names array will have this particular string in it. If I wanted to then access that value, if I said echo the first name is, if I tried to do $names square braces 0 followed by a break, if I took a look at that in my browser, you'll notice that seems to actually work just fine. Now, I should probably say that works just fine in my particular version of PHP. This is again a situation where there's a bit of a difference between some of the newer and some of the older versions of PHP. Here, I did string interpolation using my variable, just like I had done previously with my simple value of X, and you can see that here it worked just fine. In older versions of PHP, however, that would not have worked just fine. The array syntax, or the array subscript notation is I guess was too complicated for some of the earlier versions of PHP to be able to figure out. So very often putting an array with a subscript number inside a double-quoted string like I've done here would confuse the parser, and it would end up not actually showing the value of your variable. So in that kind of situation, the simple answer is just to append in the value of the array instead, something like that. And you can see that also works just fine. And again, kind of like using the array function to create new arrays. Whenever I access the value in an array, I will most likely do it by appending in the value so that the code I'm writing is not only compatible with modern versions of PHP, but will also work just fine with older versions of PHP. Alright, so moving along, I've put a value of Victrola into element 0 of my array. If I wanted to put another value into the array, I could say into the names array element 1, for example, assign the name Bernard. If I were to then echo out that value, I'm just going to copy and use the same basic echo statement I used before. The second name is, and I'll display names element 1. There, I get Bernard just fine. So hopefully from previous experience you've had with arrays, what you'll find here is that things are generally not that much different than what we've seen before. Values that are already in an array can be replaced. So if I say assign element 1 of the names array to Bernard, and then I turn around later and I say assign element 1 of the names array to be Max, then the value Bernard is replaced by Max. So in a way, the values are still treated as if they're scalar, in a way, each individual element kind of having a scalar-like behavior, but the array overall being able to store multiple values. A few of the sort of edge cases, a few of the more interesting situations you might occasionally run into with arrays in PHP. One of them being, what happens if I try to access an element of an array that doesn't exist? If I say the third name is, and I try to access names element 2, that will result in a notice if your server is configured to show them. In this case, the notice says undefined offset 2. Undefined offset is the message you'll typically get anytime you try to access a value that doesn't exist in a numerically indexed array, like what we're dealing with here. Right? I'll just comment out that line since obviously that isn't going to work. But remember that error message. You'll most likely see it occasionally. Another little interesting aspect of arrays in PHP, what happens if I were to say to names element 3, assign the value Tilly? I could of course at that point display that value. The fourth name is names element 3. There we go, Tilly shows up just fine. But what I've done here is I've actually skipped an element. We had a value that was in element 1 of the array, and now I've jumped over 2 and I've assigned a value to element 3. Well, in that kind of situation, what happens to element 2? Well, if I come back and actually uncomment my commented element 2 line and take a look, I still get an error there. Even though I have element 0, I have element 1, and I have element 3, leaving a gap where element 2 should go, PHP does not actually automatically create that element. In some languages, if you skip over elements, if you leave dead spots in your array, the language will go ahead and automatically initialize those dead spots, those dead elements, those uninitialized elements to some particular value. PHP does not do that. As a matter of fact, in PHP, even though here I'm using values like 0, 1, 2, and 3 to represent the different elements in my array, I actually try not to think about them being in any particular type of order. What PHP actually does is it's using these numbers more as just sort of a label, sort of a tag to identify particular values that are being stored in the array, more so than it's actually storing them in some particular numeric order. So a value is stored in the 0 position, you might say, or the position identified by the number 0, a value stored in the position identified by the number 1, in a position identified by number 3, but there is no value stored in the array stored in the position identified by a number 2. Essentially, there is no position identified with the number 2, despite the fact that our natural inclination would be to assume there is a 2 if there's a 1 and a 3. So fundamentally, I think these arrays in PHP work probably quite a bit like what you've seen before, enough so that hopefully you'll be able to work with them without too much of an issue. There are just those few little differences, sort of the non-numeric ordering in a way that PHP exhibits when we're jumping over elements in an array. But otherwise, most everything is probably pretty close to your expectations. A few last details about arrays before we start to wrap this up. For starters, I'm going to go ahead and comment out the echo statement that's currently causing the warning in my browser. There we go. That's just fine. A few of these other details that I wanted to point out, one of them hopefully at this point is actually obvious, and that is that arrays in PHP are dynamic in size, meaning that when I originally create an array, I do not have to specify the actual size of the array. I just let PHP know that I want to have an array created, an array will be created, and then I can then add values to it at will. I didn't have to tell it that I was going to have 3 values or 2 values or anything like that. I just add values to the array as it suits my purposes, and PHP will automatically make the array large enough to be able to handle the volume of different values that I actually assign to it. Another one of the aspects of arrays in PHP that you might have guessed at, but that currently this example doesn't really demonstrate, is that arrays are also dynamic in type. In this particular array, up to this point, I have only assigned strings to it, but if I wanted to be able to assign other values to the array, I could certainly do that as well. It doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense here, but let's say to array element 4, I want to put in the value 99. If I do that and echo out that new value, in the browser you can see that that works just fine. PHP does not at all mind if we mix data types within arrays. That of course goes back to the fact that PHP is weakly typed. It doesn't really matter what value different things are. Everything is just kind of free and available to hold any type of data at any time. Just like variables can do that, arrays have that exact same ability. The very last thing then that I might mention about arrays is that if we should happen to want to create an array that is pre-initialized, we do have that ability. In this particular case, what I did was I started off by creating an array that was empty, and then I went and added values to it, again, as it sort of suited my purposes. If I should want to, however, create an array that was pre-populated with data, I certainly have that ability as well. If I wanted to create a new array called colors, for example, I could create the array the same way I created the names array previously. But if I then pass a comma-separated list of values to the array function when that array is created, those will become initial values that will be assigned to the array in the order that they are specified. So if I put in red, blue, green, and yellow, 4 different strings, comma separated, those 4 different strings will automatically be assigned to my new colors array, and they will be assigned using numbers to label them in the order that they're given. So red will be 0, blue will be 1, green will be 2, yellow will be 3. I think I said those all right. Let's just give it a try and make sure that actually works. If I say, let's see, the colors are, and then I'm going to do colors 0, and then I will append to that a space, and then colors 1, and then a space, then colors 2, and I think that's probably enough to illustrate what it is I'm trying to show you here. If I jump back to my browser and hit refresh, you can see I get red, blue, and green, color 0, 1, color 0, color 1, and color 2 as they were assigned by the initialization that I did here with the colors array. The last thing I might say about arrays in PHP, even this particular type, is that they of course come in wonderfully handy. The situations where we tend to want to use arrays most frequently are situations where we have groups of related values. If we have a variety of different values that are all related to one another, all have some commonality between them, then arrays are very often a very convenient way to be able to store those values. Like in my example here where I'm storing a group of names. Maybe these are names of my users or names of administrators who can log on to my site. One way or another, these values are all related to one another. Another situation is maybe I've read in a group of values. Maybe that group of values is prices for products in a shopping cart, and I want to find a total. That would again be a situation where I have a group of related values that I want to store together in some convenient way, and arrays tend to be perfect for just that sort of thing.